Good morning and welcome once again to Radiant Church. I want to particularly welcome those that are at our North Campus and our Woodland Park campus. Let's give them a great big hand today. We live in a time period that is filled with so much anger that some social commentators are calling this the age of rage. And we have seen it with road rage out on the highways. People being brutalized over the most small incidents. We've seen it in social media. We have certainly seen it in the political discourse that's going on. There is a great deal of anger in our society. And we're talking about how to break free from all those things that hinder us. And God wants us to break free from sinful anger. And not only that, He wants us to be truly free to where we can actually redeem our anger. So we're going to talk about that today. Let's get started by looking at this force of anger. And the first thing I want you to see is that anger is powerful. Anger is, in fact, the greatest force of the human soul. It's been defined as the energy we experience when we confront an obstacle that prevents us from realizing a need or a desire. Another definition that I think is more succinct and maybe more memorable is it's when we're trying to defend or protect what we love. So we're trying to protect or defend something that is dear to us, and so we're angry at those things that are trying to destroy it. And because of that, there is both bad anger and there's also good anger. And I think we can see this in the words of the Apostle Paul in Ephesians 4:26. Let me read this from the New American Standard Version. It says, "Be angry and yet do not sin." That's an imperative. Paul is telling us there is a time to be angry. Church father John Chrysostom said, "He that is angry without a cause sins. And he that is not angry when there is a cause sins. For unreasonable patience is the hotbed of many vices." Malcolm Forbes put it this way: people who never get carried away should be. There is a time to be angry. Proverbs 16:32, the writer of Proverbs says, "He who is slow to anger is better than the mighty, and he who rules his spirit than he who captures a city." We have parallelism here, where it's comparing those who are slow to anger to those who are able to rule their spirit. And it's saying those who are slow to anger are actually more powerful than those who are able to capture a city through military force. There is great power to being able to control or be slow to anger. In other words, to have a long fuse. A second thing we need to see about anger is that anger is actually a characteristic of God. Do you remember when Moses wanted to see God's glory? He said, "Show me your glory. I want to see your face." And God said, "Oh, I can't do that. You couldn't handle that." He said, "But I will put you in the cleft of a rock, and I will let all of my goodness pass before you." So there we see the glory of God. And God begins to proclaim it in Exodus 34, verse 6. This is from the NIV. He says, the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God." And listen to this: "slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness." God describes Himself as an angry God. And throughout the Bible, there are 400 mentions of God being a God who is angry. But notice this about His anger: He is slow to anger. And I know people will say, "Well, I could never worship and serve a God who gets angry. My God is a God of love." And the reason people say something like that is because they don't understand what anger really is. You know, if you have a God that never gets angry, you have a God who isn't truly love. Because when we see people we truly love threatened, we're going to get angry. I think instead of being disturbed about a God who is angry, we should be far more disturbed to think that God would be able to see injustice and abuse and exploitation and violence and rape and murder and not get angry. Of course, God is angry. He has to be angry because He's a God of love, and He's going to be angry at sin. To embrace sin would be for God to embrace His own demise. So He has to be angry at sin. And God doesn't respond with benign tolerance or indifference. In fact, indifference would show a lack of love. True love at times will get angry. And anger is love in motion against whatever is threatening that which is loved. You get angry over things you love the most. And that's why God is angry over sin. He's angry at sin because he loves us. And because he loves us, he decides that he has to eliminate sin. Now, there were times when Jesus, God in the flesh, became angry. But his anger was always channeled towards specific acts of love and kindness and justice and healing. Over in Mark chapter 3, verses 1 to 5, Jesus is in the synagogue. And when he's in the synagogue, he sees a man with a withered hand. And he looks around to some of the religious leaders who were quite disgusted at thinking of the fact that Jesus would heal this man. And we read over in verse 5 that Jesus looked around at them with anger. Why was Jesus angry? He was angry at a dead religion that would be more concerned about breaking man-made rules than they'd be about a man who was hurting being healed. We also see Jesus' anger clearly in John chapter 2, verses 13 to 17. Of course, this is also repeated in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but it's the story of Jesus cleansing the temple. Now, why did Jesus cleanse the temple? Well, you've got to understand what was going on in that day. If you were coming to the temple, you would come to bring an animal for sacrifice. However, it had to be an animal without blemish, and the priests were the ones who would judge that. So many of them turned animals away that would have been completely acceptable, but instead they gouged people with high prices in the temple that they would have to buy their animals instead of use their animals. And many people traveled from such distances they couldn't bring animals. And so they had to pay these exorbitant prices. Jesus saw people getting ripped off and he was angry. It had turned God's house into a den of thieves. It was showing the Gentiles something contrary to who God was by these practices. And so Jesus was a holy divine tornado roaring through the temple. It required a holy anger to drive out all of those money changers. And it was a holy sinless anger because of the driving force behind it. And that driving force was the heart of Jesus. So let's examine Jesus' anger, because in it we're going to see how we can get angry. First of all, notice Jesus' anger was in the interest of others. Jesus' anger wasn't self-focused. It wasn't about him at all. It was about the people he cared about, and he got angry. Also, Jesus' anger had a directed purpose. You could say it was a surgical strike. He went after what was wrong and he dealt with it. Finally, Jesus' anger was under love's control. Jesus wasn't fixated with his anger. Do you ever know people who are fixated with anger? They just get angry. They are angry. They're angry people. They're grumpy and irritable and angry all the time. Jesus wasn't like that. In fact, Jesus dealt with this situation in anger, and when he was done, everything was back to normal. He went back to his ministry. In fact, he healed the sick that were there in the temple because Jesus wasn't fixated in his anger. Jesus did what Ephesians 4:26 says. Jesus did not let the sun go down on his wrath. His anger accomplished a purpose. And then third, anger is required of us if we're going to follow Jesus. Jesus got angry. He expects us to get angry. It's the idea that we are to love the sinner but hate the sin. I know that almost sounds like a platitude, but that's exactly what anger does. Or you could say it was Martin Luther King Jr. who said, we're going to love the segregationists while we hate segregation. It's the same idea. It's a biblical idea. It's a surgical anger that goes after the real problem without causing any collateral damage. This happens in parenting. And all of us that are parents can relate to this. There are things that come up in our children's lives, behaviors that they have, attitudes they have, that if we love them, we have to hate that attitude. We have to hate that behavior. And we do what we can in our power. We even become angry against that and do what we can to drive that from the life of our children through discipline or whatever it takes, not because we hate the child, but because we love the child, and our anger drives us to see them delivered from that which is harming them. And that is how anger is to work. Anger also can be sinful and destructive. There's 15 different verses in the Bible where anger and fire are in the same verse. And I think there's a reason for that, because anger is a lot like fire. Fire can be very good. It can warm you, it can cook your meals, but fire can also be very dangerous. It can burn you and it can cause a forest fire. In the same way, anger can be very good and anger can be very bad. It can be destructive. Maggie Scarf in New York Times Magazine put it this way: getting angry can sometimes be like leaping into a wonderfully responsive sports car and gunning the motor, taking off at high speed, and then discovering the brakes are out of order. And have you ever seen that? People flying into a rage. And if you fly into a rage, expect to experience a bad landing. And a lot of people, because of their anger, experience a bad landing. Part of that bad landing is the physical effects of anger on our bodies. The University of Southern California found that anger, irritability, and aggressive competitiveness of people led to a higher risk of heart disease. Anger slowly poisons your body. It causes headaches, backaches, stomach problems, and sleep disorders. Repressed anger or self-focused anger is the number one reason for depression. Holding on to anger is like grabbing a hold of a hot coal and thinking you're going to throw it to hurt somebody else when really who it hurts is you. Anger causes us to do foolish things. Proverbs 14:17 says, "A quick-tempered man acts foolishly." Now notice what we've said. We've said that God is slow to anger. We're to be slow to anger, but this is talking about a quick-tempered man. And anger can cause us to lose our view of what's really important. Norm Evans was a professional football lineman in the NFL, and he said that what caused other teams to lose many games was anger. He said for him as an offensive lineman, what he would try to do was get the defensive player on the other side to get angry at him. And the rest of the day, that player would attack him and forget all about the quarterback, and the quarterback would run free. And I think we do that many times in our life. We get angry over something that isn't that significant, and we get our eyes off those things that are truly significant. Remember, he who angers you controls you. And people do things in anger they would not have done any other way. And there's a scientific reason for that. It's called the amygdala. It's the part of the brain that processes both anger and fear. And if we're angry enough, we can go into cognitive incapacitation, and rational thought is no longer under our control. Have you ever heard people say, "My anger just took me over"? It really did. It short-circuited the brain and your anger took you over. So because of that, if you take the word anger and add a D to the front of it, you get what anger can cause, and that is danger. And so let's talk about the dangers of anger. First of all, anger is a warning sign of a deeper issue. All of us know that. We all know that, for instance, in our car, there are warning lights. And those warning lights are not the problem. You don't want to break the warning light. The warning light is telling you there is a deeper issue with the car. It's warning you of a problem in the car. And when you have issues of anger, anger isn't really the problem. The problem is what's below the surface. What is causing the issue? I remember one time I was home late at night and my wife Kelly walked through the room, and it was a dark room. She didn't know I was there. And when she got right in front of me, I went, "Boo." And when I did, let me tell you what Kelly didn't do. She didn't say, "Oh my goodness." That frightened me. That made me a little embarrassed. "Todd, I certainly hope you won't do that again." That's not what Kelly did. Kelly did get afraid and she was embarrassed, but then she got mad and angry. How do I know that? Because she started hitting me and telling me what a mean person I was. Now, that was all in fun, but the reality is that's how it operates. Underneath our anger so often is fear or frustration or pain or anxiety or embarrassment or resentment, and ultimately it's because we believe the old lie of the devil. By now you should remember it, that we, independent of God, shall be as God. We think we're a God. We think we're a demigod. We think other people should see who we really are and treat us as a God. We think everything in our life should be perfect and everybody should do what we want. And when they don't, we get angry. And that's the idea. And because of that, anger is on display in various ways in our life. One way it's in display is in explosive anger. You could call these people the spewers. They leave behind the dead, the dying, the bleeding, and the bruised, and they say, oh, but boy, do I ever feel better. It's King Saul when he took a javelin and he hurled it at Jonathan, his son. Psychiatrists and psychologists actually thought that at one time this was a good route to take. When you're angry, just let it out. But here's an article that appeared in Psychology Today. It was a letter written to them, and it says, Dear Counselor, you recommended to the mother of a 3-year-old to allow him to vent his anger by kicking the furniture. Well, my mother was told the same thing about my brother. He's now 32 years old and he's still kicking the furniture, what's left of it. But he's also kicking his wife and his kids and anything else that gets in his way. Last week, he kicked a television out of a 2nd-story window, and the window was closed at the time. Some people get angry and they throw fuming fits in order to control other people. They get what they want through their anger, and they've learned that's how they win. Yet, you really never win through anger. You may win the battle, but you lose respect, and you usually lose the very thing that you most wanted. Explosion is not the answer. The more angry people get, the more angry they have to get, and the anger just simply escalates. And all of us can restrain our anger. I know it's possible. You know how I know it's possible? Because I've seen people raging and angry and fuming, and the phone rings, and they go over and pick it up, and they say, hello, may I help you? We can control our anger. We can restrain it for a time, but too many people just explode in anger. Then another way people try to handle their anger is what I like to call implosive anger, or they're the stewers. They're the ones who bottle it up inside. They suppress their anger and they don't respond in the moment. They hold on to it for another time. Listen to me. You can bury anger, but when you do, you bury it alive. It's much like toxic waste. There was a time in America where the thought was, we can take all of this toxic waste and we can simply bury it underground and everything's going to be okay. But what we found out is eventually it comes to the surface and it causes ecological nightmares. And that's what happens to us. Eventually it comes up. Burying anger is like setting a waste paper basket on fire, putting it in the closet, and then thinking everything's okay when eventually it's going to burn down our entire house. Anger repressed can poison our relationships and cause more damage than cruel and hurtful words. Repressed anger is acidic. It's a poison to our body. Science has found it causes headaches, it causes muscle aches, and eventually it's gonna come out. And often it comes out in a sour, miserable, moody attitude. Have you ever been around somebody who's angry, but they won't tell you, they won't let it out, but they show you in every possible way? This happened with King Ahab. You may remember his story in 1 Kings chapter 21. He didn't get what he wanted. He wanted Naboth's field. And because he couldn't have it, he threw an inward tantrum. He sulked, he was solemn, he was bitter, he was displeased, and eventually it led to the death of Naboth. You see, some don't explode, but in their imploding, they figure out ways to get back at those they're angry at. It reminds me of the husband who came to his wife and said, honey, I don't get it. Whenever we fight, I roar, I rage, and you don't fight, you stay calm. He said, how do you do that? She said, really simple. She said, I simply clean the toilets. And he said, well, what good does that do? She said, it does all kinds of good. I use your toothbrush. And that's a lot of times how it works. Then there's the redirected anger. You realize that the only animal in a forest who has the opportunity to sit down and have breakfast with a bear is a skunk. Because the bear knows it's not worth swatting the skunk because of the ramifications. And a lot of people are like that. They know that they cannot attack certain people they're angry with, so they go and attack somebody else. It's the husband who's really, really upset with his boss, but he knows he can't take it out on his boss for fear of his job, so he takes it out on his wife. And the wife takes it out on the 5-year-old, and the 5-year-old takes it out on the cat, and the cat scratches the baby. That's how it works. I remember one time, I was getting in my car with my kids, and my wife was really upset with the kids. So we get in the car, we shut the doors, and we're looking at Kelly. She can't hear us. And suddenly Faye says, I can tell that mom's angry because whenever she gets angry, she begins to clean. And on cue, Kelly picks up a broom, and she just starts brooming away. And my son Luke says, oh yeah, she's mad. She's really mad. Because when she's mad, she just simply sweeps slowly. But when she's really angry, she sweeps really, really fast. And Kelly was just going like crazy. And when I came home that day, the garage was completely clean. So there are good ways to redirect your anger, but there are other ways that are really quite damaging. Another danger of anger is that anger provides a foothold for spiritual darkness. And this is a key verse. Ephesians 4:27 from the Living Bible says, when you are angry, you give a mighty foothold to the devil. That word foothold could be the word opportunity. When you're angry and you don't deal with your anger, you are giving a foothold, an opportunity to the evil one. It's like you're laying down a welcome mat and saying, Satan, come on in. And what can happen in people's lives is through their anger, Satan gets influence in their lives, and eventually the only way they're going to get free is to confront the darkness. Now, we're going to be dealing with this extensively during our Break Free Encounter weekend, but I want you to realize the damage that can be caused, including demonic influence in our life through anger. Also, anger is contagious. Over in Proverbs 22:24-25, the writer of Proverbs says, make no friendship with an angry man, and with a furious man do not go, lest you learn his ways and set a snare for your soul. Reminds me of something written by Billy Martin in his book, Number One. He wrote about a time when he and the famous baseball legend Mickey Mantle were going to go hunting, and they were going to hunt in Texas. And Mickey knew the man who owned the ranch. So they drove up to the house, and Mickey got out of the car by himself and went into the house and saw the rancher and said, do you mind if I hunt on your property? And the rancher said, oh, Mickey, have your way with the place. He said, but I have a favor to ask of you. He said, we have an old pet mule that's out in the barn, and he's gone blind, and we need to kill him, but I just can't do it. He said, could you take your shotgun and go out and shoot him? And so Mickey said, well, that'll help you out. I'll do it. So he jumped out in the car, and he thought he'd play a trick on Billy Martin. He acted furious. He jumped in the car and he said, that man, I've done so much for him, and he won't let me do any hunting on his property. This is just making me furious. And so he drove like a madman across the parking lot, slammed on the brakes in front of the barn, jumped out with his shotgun, went in, and you hear Billy in the background saying, don't do it, Mickey, don't do it. But he hears, boom. And then right after that, Mickey hears, boom, boom. He goes out, and Billy has a shotgun as well. And he said, what are you doing, Martin? He said, I'm so mad now, I just killed 2 of his cows. And that can happen. You've all seen it. You've seen people get extremely angry, and that anger is contagious. You know, you get home and you're all upset, and your wife is just fine, and pretty soon she's fuming and she's upset because anger is contagious. And here's something else you need to know. Anger is judged by God. Matthew 5:22, Jesus said, but I say to you that whoever is angry with his brother without a cause, so this isn't righteous anger, this is ungodly anger, shall be in danger of the judgment. Remember Moses? He was a great, great, great leader. And he was promised that he would be able to take the children of Israel into the promised land. But he never saw that. You know why? Because of his anger. He got so angry, he struck a rock when God didn't want him to. And his outburst of anger led to him not being able to go into the land of promise. People can be short-circuited and kept back from their destiny in God because of their anger. Now, if all that is true, how do we break free from anger? Well, let's look at that. The first thing we have to do is we have to admit our anger. We have to confess our anger. And isn't that where we so often start in the Break Free series? You gotta first of all admit there's a problem. Proverbs 28:13, the writer of Proverbs says, "He who conceals his sins does not prosper, but whoever confesses and renounces them finds mercy." Galatians 5:19-20 from the NAS says, "Now the deeds of the flesh are evident, which are," and then it goes on to say, "outbursts of anger." Colossians 3:8 from the NIV says, "But now you must rid yourself of all such things as anger and rage." We are to get rid of anger and rage. We're to get rid of the anger that's in our life. Now, anger can be deceptive. This sinful anger I'm talking about often disguises itself. We just aren't honest with ourselves. And we'll call it justice or fairness or righteous indignation. You say, "Oh, I was just righteously angry." Really? Are you sure it was righteous anger? Or you say, "Oh, I just am assertive," or maybe I was just in a bad mood. Just admit it. When it's sinful anger, you've got to own up to it and say, "I did that for the wrong reason. I am sinfully angry." And then, second of all, restrain our anger. What I'm saying is you can hold off. You don't have to fly into a rage. You can hold off. And unless you restrain your anger, you're never going to be able to deal with your anger. James 1:19 from the NIV says, "My dear brother," writes James, "take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak," and listen to this, "slow to become angry." There it is, slow to anger. If you're not, then you're going to have problems. Lawrence Peters said this, "Speak when you're angry and you'll make the best speech you'll ever regret." And I think all of us have done that at times. When we're slow to anger, then we can begin to analyze our anger. And what we're going to find many times is that we have disordered anger, that we're angry in the wrong way. 350 years before Jesus, the philosopher Aristotle made an amazing statement about anger. He said, anyone can become angry. That's easy. But to be angry with the right person, to the right degree, at the right time, for the right purpose, in the right way, that's not easy. So too often, our anger is aimed at the wrong person in the wrong degree for the wrong purpose, and that is disordered anger. So we have to recognize when our anger's disordered. And the way we do that is by analyzing our anger. That's the third key. You have to analyze your anger. Proverbs 24:29 is very instructive. I think this is interesting. The writer of Proverbs says, "Do not say." So when he says do not say, who you're saying it to? You're saying it to yourself. "I will do to him just as he's done to me. I will render to the man according to his works." That's self-talk. He is saying, here's what I'm going to do to him. Here's what he did to me. Here's what's going to happen. And that's what we often do. Now, please really listen to this. So often in life, the problem isn't what happens to you. It's what you think about what happens to you. Isn't that the truth? I know people that can have a little incident happen and they blow it off quite easily, or they deal with it quite simply, and others fly into an absolute rage over the same thing. What's the difference? How they process it, how they look at it, how they think about it. Now, instead of being vulnerable and admitting our hurt, insecurity, and weakness, so often we just get angry. And I know this from experience. Probably my worst experience with this was at a time in my life where I had some people who I felt betrayed me in a certain way. They were a little bit dishonest about something and got in my way in something that seemed quite simple. And what really bothered me, I had these other people who had always been very, very supportive and who I felt I'd done a great deal for and had a lot of credibility with, who then didn't support me. And this incident made me angry. And I felt I had a righteous indignation. I deserved to be angry. You know what the real problem was? My pride was stung. My pride was stung. I had a real wounding of my pride. And because of that, I acted in a way that wasn't necessarily sinful in the action, but it wasn't wise. And it took my life in a completely different direction at the time, for good or bad. But it was all because of my pride that then I displayed through anger and angry actions that I normally wouldn't do. And I have to say, I really learned from that. But it's not the last time that my pride has caused me problems because I thought I knew better than I did. And I'd have to say that all of us are like that at times. What are some of the weaknesses in your character? Because those are areas where you're going to tend to get angry. Now, we have to analyze our anger. So if we're slow to anger and start analyzing, here's some questions we should ask ourselves. What's behind my anger? What really happened? What am I defending? That's a good one. What am I defending? Why am I so mad? Is it worth being angry about this? And what's the wisest way to respond to this? Should I just forgive and let it go? Or do I actually need to confront the person in this situation? Without analyzing our anger, we're going to tend to regret what we do. Ben Franklin said, whatever begins in anger ends in shame. A fourth key to redeeming our anger is, in fact, to do just that. Redeem our anger. After we've analyzed it, we can redeem it. Matthew 5:44, Jesus said, but I say to you, love your enemies. Bless those who curse you. Do good to those who hate you. And pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you. If you're slow to anger and you analyze your anger, then you can redeem your anger and make it a force for good. And it may be you need to respond in love and grace and forgiveness, and other times you have to make a surgical strike. But I think we have to see if our anger is like Jesus' anger. That is our anger in the interest of others, or is it self-interest? Does your anger have a direct purpose? And is your anger under the Holy Spirit's control? What a question. Can you literally say, can you genuinely, honestly say, my anger right now is under the Holy Spirit's control? Because if it isn't, don't act. Because the big problem isn't our anger, it's acting on our anger. And wait till you come under the Spirit's control to act on your anger. And then finally, we need to replace our anger. What do I mean by that? Here's what I mean, and this is so important. We get so uptight, so upset, so angry and fuming over petty things, over minimal things, over things that mean so very little. A lot of people are in a fight because they're not in one. They want to fight because they're not in a real fight. Let me tell you what a real fight is. A fight against human sex trafficking. A fight against hunger, a fight against thousands and millions of souls slipping into a Christless eternity. Those are things to get angry about. Those are the things to get passionate about. Those are the things that we should use our anger to drive us to make a difference in this world. And let me tell you, if you have a real vision, a real purpose, a real destiny in mind, if you're pursuing God's eternal purposes, you're not going to get so angry about little things. Your anger is going to be focused on eternal things. And may it be in the name of Jesus. Now I want you to think about Jesus. God become a man in the person of Jesus, and mankind was angry at God. Some are angry at God because they don't think God's running the universe the way he should. If I were God, then things would be different. God didn't give me what I wanted. God didn't come through for me, so I'm angry with God. And the whole human race was like that. We would even say something like this: if I could get my hands on God, I'd kill him. You say people don't really say that. Of course they do. Because when God became killable in the person of Jesus, we killed him. We took him and we beat him. and we mocked him, and we ridiculed him, and we tortured him, and we put him on a cross. And there, he had a choice what to do. Don't you know God could have become angry in the wrong way? God could have simply exploded. He could have called for legions of angels who would have come and completely wiped out the planet. Or he could have imploded. He could have decided to just pull himself away. He could have gone to heaven and said, forget the human race. But he didn't do either one of them. He took his anger and he used it for good. And he allowed himself to take the anger of the human race. In fact, he took the anger of a holy God against sin to himself, but he did it for a purpose. He did it to die the death we deserved. He went into death, killed death, rose from the dead, victorious over death, hell, and the grave. And the one who is the conquering champion is the one who's conquered anger and can redeem anger in our lives. So let's pray together today.